We have a million ways to plan out every aspect of our photographic time, but my guest today invites us to leave room for the unexpected, and in doing so, to be open to what pulls at both our heart and our eyes. Welcome to Pixels, where we explore the heart and art of photography. I'm Beth Below, and I'm grateful that you're spending this time with me. I'm pleased to welcome Wendy Bagnall to the podcast. There's so much wisdom in what she shares, whether she's talking about the healing qualities of nature, the value of capturing both the literal and the abstract qualities of a landscape, or why in-camera creativity is part of the joy that she experiences in making art. Wendy is a photographic artist who lives in England. The natural landscape is the inspiration behind her work, which is an interpretation of what she sees. Wendy's approach is unrestrictive and often with an abstract quality, augmenting the light, texture, and topography of the landscape, creating pieces that aim to evoke an emotional connection with the viewer. A very special thank you to my video editor extraordinaire, Alex Armitage, and to Nick Stover and Nature Photography classes for partially making this channel possible through their Inspired Creator grants. You can learn more and submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspired-creator. If you're listening to this podcast on an audio-only platform, you can look at the images that we referenced during the episode by going to pixelspodcast.com and navigating to the episode webpage, and there you'll find a slideshow that accompanies the podcast. Your likes, your shares, your comments are welcome. I would love to know what stands out to you, what's meaningful to you in this conversation, and maybe what questions it brings up for you. Please support this channel by doing a subscribe and enabling notifications so that you don't miss a single upcoming episode. Now, on to the conversation. Hello, Wendy. Welcome to Pixels. I'm so glad we're chatting today, and we're chatting across the world. Right?
We are across the pond, as we call it.
Across
here.
The pond, yes.
Yeah, the big pond.
And so where are you in the UK?
So I'm in the southeast in the county of Surrey. So I'm probably about 45 minutes out of London, south of London.
Oh.
But it's a great location because it's not far from London. It's not far from airports to, when you want to go somewhere further afield, and only an hour from the coast as well. So,
beautiful.
And we're in the countryside, so kind of have it all.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And I'm in Michigan, and I'm 15 minutes from the coast, I guess,
nice.
of Lake Michigan, and 45 minutes from the next biggest city. So like you, I appreciate this more peace or a slower pace of a location where we still have access to a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I've been starting out my conversations by asking, what's making you smile today?
My daughter did a charity bike ride yesterday. She's 17, and with some work colleagues, they cycled 75 kilometers. And so she was really kind of stiff and sore this morning. So it sounds probably a bit cruel, but we were having a bit of a giggle this morning as she was trying to move about and get her day going.
Yeah.
So because she's not a cyclist, like she doesn't normally cycle. That's not her kind of mode of exercise, shall we say. So it was a bit of, I did warn her, I said, you're going to need lots of padding.
Yes. And then lots of ibuprofen or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, if she's 17, you said, wait until she hits 50.
Exactly.
Yeah. I've been, following your work on Instagram for a while, at least a couple of years. And I'm intrigued by your beautiful images that, the landscapes that you take both this literal approach for some and more abstract in others. But somehow even with that, it always seems like it's you.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you approach a scene, like what's your process for how you're approaching the landscape, and how much visualization or experimentation, just maybe talk a little bit about your philosophy around how you approach it.
So your point about the literal and the more abstract is really my journey with photography. I started out more literal and I've gone more abstract with time. And that's come from a range of things, really. One, learning how to photograph in an abstract way in the camera, because I tend to not do my multiple exposure work through Photoshop. It's made in camera. In terms of my approach, it's really based on two things. One, I guess, something within me says I have to be creative today. I want to be creative today, and that kind of pulls me out into the landscape. And then the other would be I don't go out with any specific expectations. I'm not one of these people who finds a location and then spends time thinking, right, I need to come here on this day at this time in these weather conditions. So I go out, no expectations, and really work with what catches my eye. And there will be certain weather conditions. So if it snowed or if there's fog, then I'll think, these are conditions I like to work with. So I will go out then. So I see something that catches my eye and I kind of look at it and think, there's a composition in this somewhere for me because there's something about this which, for want of a better expression, speaks to me. So, and then I will look more closely at the subject and decide what it is that is really pulling me in. So if it's a small scene, is it the water droplets? Is it the texture of branches? If it's more of a wide landscape, is it the shape of the hills? Is it the position of forest within the landscape? And then I will work to emphasize those elements both in the field and then in post-processing.
As you're doing that, and this is going back to that literal and abstract, what is your process for deciding, I suppose? I'm assuming maybe there's intention if this is a literal image or you want to go in abstract direction.
In terms of the journey, I started off with much more literal photography, and that was very much around when I was trying to figure out my approach, my style, and also to learn photography, if that makes sense, learn composition, not necessarily following the classic rules of composition. I don't think I do that a lot, but, sort of making sure I understand how to work with the camera properly. And one thing I did early on was I forced myself to make every photograph using manual mode only. So I'd set my own aperture, my own shutter speed, my own ISO, and work with that triangle in order to get the effect that I wanted, because sometimes I might underexpose an image intentionally or I'll overexpose intentionally. So that was kind of a big important part of the process for me. And then as I became more comfortable with that, I then discovered the work of some other photographers and this whole idea of in-camera multiple exposure. I was aware of ICM and I was aware of, perhaps working with longer exposures with things like water, but multiple exposure really caught my eye. And having already learnt how to work with the camera in manual mode, I was then able to start being more creative with the multiple exposure. So when I go out and see a scene, I don't necessarily in that particular moment know which way I will go, but I would say 80% of the time now it is in more abstract and more often a multiple exposure or multiple exposure blended with ICM. Although I did a couple of weeks back during the height of autumn, I just had this urge to go out and just take photographs of autumn as it was. I didn't want to mess with it. And I think that was because it's just the most enchanting season. And where I live, the county I live in is one of the most wooded, is the most wooded county in the country, actually. So we have a lot of woodland. We don't have much farmland. And where I live in particular, it's classed as an area of outstanding natural beauty. So there's a lot of woodland. And you walk around and it's just like you're in a big jewelry box,
Oh,
all the
wow.
autumn color, the leaves. It doesn't necessarily, it's not the same as like a New England fall colors. It's different. I have been there. I've seen that. It's different, but it's just these really small, intimate scenes of just beautiful autumn color. So I did intentionally go out to photograph that as it was. I didn't do masses, but I just had a really lovely time picking out these little scenes. I also like to work with the more abstract and the multiple exposure with autumn as well, because it's just got so much to offer.
Yeah. It's a photographer's playground.
Yeah.
Whenever we find those leaves and all that color and whatnot.
Especially when they're backlit.
Yes, absolutely agree. What about, like you were talking about, sometimes you'll go like high key or low key and make these intentional decisions in the field. And I'm wondering what your relationship is to the emotions you might be feeling, or the sense or the energy of the space you're in, and what your awareness is of that as it relates to these processing, sort of in the moment processing decisions that you're making. Like,
Yeah.
how are you aware of those things, if that's conscious to you?
I think for me, that process of being in nature, observing nature, and then being creative with it, if you like, it's my form of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So I did have an actual therapist once, not a therapist that I was seeing, but a person who was a therapist once said to me, "How do you, what's your form of therapy? How do you look after your mental health?" And I said, "Well, for me, it's just about being in nature. I go out and I'm in nature, and there's just, I think, a lot of us as we get older appreciate nature more. That's not to say that younger people don't appreciate it, but I just think you start to value personal time more. And when you're in nature, it's often a space of personal time, a time for reflection. For me, it's also a huge distraction from the day to day. So all the noise and the busyness in your head. So the connection is really, like I say, it's a sort of cathartic, therapeutic process, as opposed to, perhaps something more tangible. It's just a freedom. It's space to breathe. If I go out for just a walk in nature, I do really enjoy it, and I enjoy that time, but I'm still ruminating as I'm walking around. All the thoughts are still going on in my head. But when I've got my camera in hand, I'm not doing that, because I'm looking for things that I want to photograph. And as I say, they're things that speak to me, that sort of jump out at me, that catch my eye. Yeah, and then at the end of it, I guess I just feel rejuvenated. When I've packed up my camera bag and I'm walking back to the car, and you never really know if you're going to like what's on the back of the camera until you get it up on the computer. But a lovely sense of release and relaxation as I walk back to my car or back to my house if I've gone from the front door. Yeah, I think that's the emotional side of it for me. It's that sort of therapeutic process that helps keep me balanced and sane.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a losing of ourselves, like you were saying. We get all that chatter, and then when we are, it seems like, and I had this conversation with another photographer about, like, we can think that the lens or the camera is coming between us and nature, but in another way, it actually helps bring us closer to it, because we're paying attention in a different way, or at least that's what I found.
And if I'm working with multiple exposure as well, it's it's an interesting process when you're doing it. I guess whether you're doing it post or in camera, but in camera, you're looking to try and create the composition in the camera in the field. So there's not going to be a huge amount of tweaking. When you get it back into your post processing, you can crop. And obviously you can do the usual edits that you would do with any photograph, but there's a lot of sort of mental gymnastics that go on, because as you take each exposure, you've got to think, well, where am I positioning those pieces? And are there any factors that I'm changing with the next exposure? Am I going to zoom in more? Am I going to zoom out more? Am I going to use some ICM, or is it just going to be stills? So having found the subject and considered a composition, if it's a multiple exposure, it's generally a more complex process for me anyway, at least. Therefore, I become even more absorbed in what I'm doing. But the camera hasn't distracted me from that, because I know that actually the enjoyment of that whole process and that scene and what I was looking at and what excited me is a process that I'm bringing back home to look at and revisit and work with and play with even more. When I'm sat of an evening on a dark winter's evening, which we've got a lot of at the moment in the UK, the camera doesn't get in the way for me. But it does become something that forces me to think even deeper.
Yeah. And this is refreshing the conversation I had with Stephanie Johnson several months ago, where we were talking about our love of doing making those creative decisions in camera, as opposed to taking single images and going into Photoshop and layering and doing that sort of thing. And you're reminding me about what's energizing about doing it in camera. How it makes the brain fire in a different way.
I don't know if it's because I've not explored Photoshop as much. I've not really spent a lot of time trying to learn that as an art form. I don't know if I have the kind of brain and it may be because I don't understand the possibilities of how you can do it in Photoshop. But at the moment, I don't have the capacity to come up with a composition where I'm thinking, right, I'll take a photograph of that and a photograph of that and a photograph of that. And then when I get them in Photoshop, I'm going to do this, this, and this. That's not how I'm working at the moment. And maybe I will be in the future. I don't know. But at the minute, it's all about what am I doing right here, right now? Where do I want that? And I very rarely point my camera at 3 completely different scenes and make the image. I mean, they're all exposures from the same subject, the same space. But having said that, I love the fact that I've not done that yet, where I'm photographing from different images, different scenes, because that's something that I've yet to explore. Because so much of this process of creativity and building a body of work or building different portfolios, having an anchor. What is the anchor that makes this portfolio, or what's the anchor that makes this portfolio, kind of thing, or project? Like if you did a photo project, what's the anchor?
Yeah, wonderful. I love that idea of an anchor. There's something grounding about that that it just kind of gives you that central point that's useful to hook into, and keeps you from getting too lost.
Absolutely.
Well, let's take a look at some images and learn a little bit more about the stories behind them. And I know these first 3 that we're going to be looking at are your pivot pixels that represent some sort of shift in your journey. So would you tell us a little bit about the image that we're looking at now?
Sure. So this is a local photograph. It's a place where I've walked probably for the last 20 or so years, and we don't often get snow in the southeast of England, so it's a rare treat when we do get it. And this photograph was made when I was in that phase, as I was explaining, where I'd switched to manual mode, and it was about trying to compose everything using the settings and creating everything myself. But it was also in that period just sort of after COVID. So this was sort of January 2021. And I don't like to talk about COVID too much. I don't think anybody does, but it was a just bizarre time in the world. And it was absolutely horrific for so many people. But for me, it was a window to come back to my creativity and my photography. It was something that I'd sort of shelved for quite a few years in a bigger way because of family and career and all of those things. But I still did photography, but it was more in the phone in my pocket in that respect. This was it was the start of my Seeing Silence collection, which was where I was really discovering that the landscape was this therapeutic space for me. I had my own health challenges at the time, which meant COVID was one of those things where I felt perhaps a bit vulnerable, but was also afforded a lot of freedom because I didn't go to work for quite a while and didn't have to travel and commute. And the nature of the job I had was that I couldn't really do much of the work at home anyway. So when my poor husband became tied to Zoom meetings, I just had all this freedom. My daughter was old enough to be independent enough to get on with her learning. So it was a fantastic opportunity for me to pick the camera back up and remind myself how much I loved this creative medium and to sort of learn it in anger. And that's when I sort of made the decision around then to start building my first portfolio, which I called the Seeing Silence collection, because it was exactly that. It was, we think of silence as something that we hear, but when you look at something that creates an inner silence in you, that was sort of where that collection came from.
Oh, that's lovely. I'm curious, as you, like with this image and probably subsequent ones, did you have the project in mind as you started, or did it evolve as you went? It
evolved after I'd taken a few of the images from the portfolio. As it started to come together, I started to look at things in my Lightroom. I was organizing things into different groups. And after I'd probably got sort of 4 or 5 images, this is where I started to be able to look at the work and identify what it was giving me, what the process was giving me, that silence. And I also started to see, I suppose to some extent, a certain identity in those images that perhaps reflected that silence. They're all images that are quite quiet. They're not big, shouty images. And quite a lot of them, this particular image, there is snow, but there was also quite dense fog up at that woodland that you see in the distance, which is why you can only really see the darker trunks in shadow, and a lot of the tree canopy you can't see because of the fog. It goes up to a brow of a hill, up to a ridge, and so that was just sitting in this sort of it wasn't a really thick fog, because otherwise the foreground would have also been quite crowded out and cloudy as well. But that sort of subtle soft fog that was giving me more negative space in the distance. So all of the images just started to have that feel about them, that sort of quiet sense about them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because sometimes getting started with a project can be a little bit of a mysterious thing. And like, what comes first?
Yeah.
The idea, the images, the emotion.
And at the minute I have an idea for a project, but I've never done it that way round. So I don't know if I don't know how it's going to go. I don't know if I'm going to enjoy it, or it's more that I've gone out and explored, and then I start to build something, and then I look at it and think, yes, that's what this is. That's what that means. And so it'll be interesting to see by doing it the other way round, because by deciding on a project, I guess I'm trying to force a connection somehow. I think I've decided on a project that I've chosen because I feel I have a connection with that sort of landscape that I'm thinking about. But at the same time, I guess until I go out and start making, it will be hard to know how it will turn out and whether it will have that same sense of identity about it.
Yeah, great point. And to, it's reminding us to pay attention to the personal, intuitive, connective side of things. Yeah. It's not, I saw somebody do this project and, oh, that's a cool idea. I'm going to do something similar. It's more, what are you personally attracted to in some way?
Yes. And I do think there's a lot to learn from trying to copy others, because that's how you can pick up the skills, because you can look at something and think, well, I really want to create that. So whether that's you've got to learn the composition or the technical aspect of how the photograph was made, or the processing, it can be a really good way to learn. But I don't know that I'm convinced somebody would be able to create a body of work that hangs together when they are always copying someone else's work, because it won't have, I don't think it would have that identity. So copying is fine to an extent, or, I guess it's taking inspiration, isn't it, and taking ideas. But if you want to create something which has your emotional identity on it, that sort of has to come from your way of seeing, not somebody else's way of seeing.
Definitely. That's been, are you familiar with Cole Thompson and his photographic celibacy
No,
philosophy?
I'm not actually, but I'll look that up. Cole
look
Thompson.
that up. It's
I will.
It's a subject of hot debate.
Okay.
and it gets at what you're saying. He goes so far as to say, I'm not going to look at anybody else's work because that will overly influence, my own vision. And so, there's debates on both sides of what is powerful and transformative about that approach and what it might be shortchanging you in.
That is really interesting. I really like that idea of saying I'm not going to look at somebody else's work. I don't think I could ever do that because I quite like social media. I know a lot of people talk about it in different ways, but I quite like social media for certain things. But at the same time, I guess we could all self-reflect a bit that if we weren't so overexposed to art in all its forms because of the internet and social media, and all we had was, the book on the shelf or in the library, how different would our work be? What would we have not seen that has influenced us? And for me, I had to learn about multiple exposure from somewhere, and actually it was through a social media account, not a book. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Say you're not going to look at somebody else's work or anybody's work to have your own authentic style. Interesting.
I'm finding myself coming down on the side of practicing sort of photographic abstinence when I am going someplace new. Like I'm thinking of, 3 places I'm traveling in the new year. And instead of scoping out and scouting, what are the interesting landmarks? Where should I go? What's possible by looking like Google Images? I'm going to forego that and just trust that when I show up, I'm going to be drawn to something, and whatever I'm drawn to is going to be a reflection of my authentic intuition and interests and style and identity.
I would go with it because, I've done it before, where you start looking at satellite images, Google Earth or whatever, and you think, oh, that looks like an interesting place to go. And those processes can be really beneficial and can be really useful. But I think I've just learned over time that that's not my approach to expressing my creativity. It's really about going somewhere for whatever reason. I have a trip coming up in January. I'm going up to Scotland. I love Scotland. We have family in Scotland. I feel a connection to Scotland. But regardless of all of that, it's a beautiful, dramatic place. And I literally will just be driving along and there'll be a left turn coming up. And I think, oh, I'm going to go down there and just follow my nose. And I like that because I'm exploring in a very unknown way. Safely, of course.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, it's more unknown rather than pre-planned or premeditated.
Yeah. And that's making me think of some story I read or interview I heard with a gentleman who was talking about not using, this is sort of parallel, like trying to find a place to eat in a new city, not going to Yelp or Google Maps and the restaurant lists. He's like, we used to just discover things. And now we research, we look at the menu, we see how many stars it has, all of this. And it kind of takes the adventure out of it.
Yes.
So what you just described, like, oh, I'm going to take a left here because something is pulling me. That's injecting some of that adventure back that we sometimes don't even realize that we have let go of.
Yes. Yeah.
because we have so much capacity to research something to death.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I do it locally as well. There are so many country
Yeah.
lanes and back roads.
Mm.
You know, I've had days where I've been planning to head to the coast for the day, and I've not got there till 3 o'clock in the afternoon because I did exactly that and took a left turn
Mm-hmm.
and then found this gorgeous lake with reeds
Mm-hmm.
or but then the nice thing about that is I've then found places to take my husband to and my daughter. You know, it's lovely when you get to know your local area quite
Yes.
in depth, and then you can enjoy it and appreciate it with other people as well.
Yeah. We don't have to travel far to find a lot of possibility.
Yeah,
And the expression
absolutely.
like, let's go for a ramble.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
we need
Yeah.
to just go for rambles more.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
I love I don't know, the delicacy of this image. So maybe you tell us a little bit about this one.
Sure. So this is a really special image for me. It's part of the Seeing Silence collection. It was made after the first one. I went through a phase of watching quite a lot of the big YouTubers, mainly the UK ones. Some of the American
Mm-hmm.
was learning to do focus stacking. And
Mm-hmm.
this particular area, this common land, as we call it, is quite diverse. And what you see in the foreground there is actually small shrubs that were affected by wildfire damage.
Mm.
And around it are the grasses that have recovered. And it was a foggy morning, winter. So the backdrop was very soft and delicate, and everything was, you know, slightly diffused. And yeah, that kind of composition and wanting the foreground to be sharp, but I also wanted the distance to be sharp as well, just because it was already soft from the weather conditions. And so
Mm-hmm.
that sort of group of trees to the right and the reeds that you can see in the middle that sit just in front of a small body of water. I really wanted all of the elements to be in focus. And I worked with a series of images in this location, but in 2022, I entered this into the Royal Academy of Arts Summer Exhibition in the UK, which is a huge exhibition. It's hosted in London at the Royal Academy. The exhibition started in the late 1800s. Your work sits alongside professional artists and amateurs and semi-professionals, and it's just the most wonderful thing. And anyway, I entered it for the exhibition, and it was shortlisted and then selected. And I can't describe to you how it looks in print. In print, it is just, there's even a goose that you can't see in that very clearly. But
Oh,
on the
wow.
water, towards the back left, there's a goose, which when it's printed, it was printed large for the exhibition. It was 40, was it? No, 36 by 24 inches.
Nice.
And float mounted and, you know, beautifully framed. And yeah, so it's a really special image for me, having
Yeah.
made it into the exhibition.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Yeah, and I think what's also important about it is this confidence that
Mm-hmm.
comes from having your work acknowledged in that way. And I know, you know, art is subjective, and what one person likes, another person doesn't, and all of that. It was an edition of 25 images, and 13 sold from the edition in the
Nice.
exhibition. That was sort of an even bigger boost, the fact that people were
Yes.
happy to hand over their hard-earned pennies for it.
Yeah.
It's great. It's a really special image, and I actually have a copy hanging at home because I do genuinely like it anyway.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
location is quite special to me. It's really, really close, really local to me. Again,
Yeah. Yeah. Again, right in our own backyard, metaphorically
yeah,
speaking.
yeah,
And now I think I see that goose. So
ah,
what I'm curious about also is this seems like compared to the first image that we saw with the snowy tree, which was, you know,
yeah,
quite literal. This is like just a little dip into the abstract in that your sense of scale is a
yeah,
little bit
yeah,
murky. Um,
yes, yeah,
So it's like a toe in that world of raising a question in the viewer of what am I looking at?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And obviously the focus is on, I sort of look at them as a little
Mm-hmm,
family that's still
mm-hmm.
standing after the devastation,
Yes. Yeah.
and the idea that they will, like the grasses around have, that there's potential there for them to regenerate.
Yeah.
The landscape there is managed, it's looked after, so they try to leave things that they believe still have life in them to come back. I think that the landscape there, on the whole, is quite vast. It's open, and then there are isolated. There are Scots pines in the background, so these are,
Mm-hmm.
small kind of knee-high shrubs in the foreground, and then you've got those huge Scots pines in the background. But actually, they're not dominating the image, but they give a
Right.
sense of place, I guess.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
yes, I see what you say when it's slightly more abstract than literal, but still working within that single exposure mode
Yeah.
before I developed and moved on to exploring the multiple exposure and ICM.
And I think that your next image, this third pivot,
Yeah,
probably represents a shift into that realm.
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. So this was the first, I think, multiple exposure that I created that I really liked, and was the catalyst for my collection that I call Imagined, which probably the title probably makes sense because they're not literal representations of the landscape. But this was in Dartmoor in Devon. I actually went to go to a sort of famous woodland there, which I did get to, and it was beautiful, but it didn't inspire me to make photographs, particularly. It's a photograph it's a place that's been well photographed by people in a sort of quite a mythical woodland way. Driving back again, it was that spontaneous, ahead of me I could see these rolling moorland, and that was sort of fractured by these pine forests.
mm-hmm.
And that was kind of what struck me about the place. And so that was when I experimented with the multiple exposure, and what's happened is it's created this layering. It's layered the areas of forest, and then it's layered the sort of soft rolling moorland, and together it just captured me because I felt like it was still a
Mm-hmm.
representation of what I was looking at.
Yeah.
And obviously I've worked with it in post processing, and at the bottom of the image there I've pulled the shadows right down
Mm-hmm.
to give a really dark footing so that the eye moves up towards the tips of the pine forest and then onto the sort of moorland and that negative space of the sky. But it's just a really pivotal image for me because it was the start of that multiple exposure journey and that collection, the Imagined collection.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love the pines that anchor the hills. It's
Yeah, and it's that
yeah,
contrast as well, isn't it? Because the hills are
yeah.
the smooth, long
Mm-hmm.
lines, and the pines are these sort of really textured, short, jagged.
Yes.
So there's a complete contrast there as well in the two textures.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very powerful that way. And what you said about this being a well photographed place, I find that is part of what often moves me towards the abstract. Is if I'm someplace where I feel like this has been photographed a gazillion times, abstract is the only way in my imagination that I can create something that feels honest or mine in some way. And I'm wondering if that's part of that story for you in terms of creating something unique.
There is definitely an element to that because I don't have a desire to want to make something that somebody else has made.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think I've become a bit frustrated with some places that you visit. And I went to Iceland with my family, and it's
Mm-hmm.
such an amazing place. We went on a family holiday, and we got to this really well-known waterfall, and there were just I mean, we were quite lucky because we were staying in a hotel that was almost at the foot of the waterfall. So we were up and had breakfast and were out at the waterfall early. But within an hour, it was teeming with coach loads of people from, well, countries all over the world, really. But they would just jump out of the bus. The weather wasn't great, but it's Iceland, right? The weather's not going to be great. They would jump out of the bus, run over to this waterfall, completely inappropriately dressed for the location and the weather, get their Instagram selfies, and get back on the bus. And so I feel a bit sad about how places have become Instagram shoots. You know, I heard, I think it was Adam Gibbs talking about in Canada, it's become a real issue at not Lake Louise, it's the other, is it Moraine Lake? No, the one where the Seven Sisters Mountains are. Anyway, and I visited there when, you know, 30 years ago. I'm showing my age now. It was so peaceful. You know, there was a handful of people there and that was it. And now they've had to close the location and close the road and force people to have to walk into it to try and reduce the traffic and the footfall. And so you see a photograph of somewhere that ends up being photographed many times, and you're looking at this beautiful, tranquil image. And then you go and visit and it's not tranquil. It's beautiful, the location, but it's not tranquil if there are thousands of people standing there with their smartphones taking photographs for their Instagram accounts. You know, we're part of that problem, really, aren't we? Because if we're the ones that are taking the photographs and sharing them, and we use social media. I mean, I certainly don't go around taking selfies of myself at these places because I just prefer to be on the other side of the camera, and I'm just a different generation, so it's not what I do. Yeah, I think it's kind of sad. So I want to experience some of these places because they are amazing and they are beautiful. I don't seek them out to photograph them because when I have, I've been disappointed when I've got there. And so actually my creativity kind of goes meh because I'm not feeling inspired because of what's around me.
Well, there's so much. It's like we've intruded on the scene. In such a way that it really detracts. And I've spoken with multiple photographers on this podcast now who've shared images where they say, this scene does not exist anymore, or you can't go to this scene anymore because people. And it's quite sad that is the state we're in.
And then, you know, other access points to these places get blocked off because people make careless decisions about how they're accessing or leaving litter, or they're a danger to themselves or others because they're not accessing it in a way that observes certain safety, common sense safety, and then that limits it for everybody else as well. So it's a really difficult one, and everybody should be allowed to enjoy these spaces, but I think enjoying the spaces is a lot more than hopping off the coach, getting a selfie before your hair goes frizzy and getting back on the coach kind of thing. And I'm sorry if anybody's listening to this and that's what they do and that sounds hypercritical. You know, I truly believe that these places need to be protected.
Well, and there's enjoying it and respecting it. I mean, I think what we're talking about is you might enjoy it, but there's been too much disrespect of it or dishonoring of it for what it is beyond hey, look at me and I'm in a cool spot.
Exactly.
So, I felt torn about places that I want to go that I know are also magnets for tourists. And it's what the expression, this is why we can't have nice things, comes to mind.
It's one of the joys of where I live, really, the southeast of England. It's not a massive honeypot photography location. There are, they do, you know, Scotland is, I'm going up to Scotland. But I don't feel, and there are tourists in Scotland, of course, and the Lake District is beautiful, and Wales, they're all big places that draw people for their landscapes. But I would say you do tend to get a lot of people that go there to enjoy the landscape in the traditional sense, you know, they're hiking or mountain biking or doing photography or something. So,
Yeah, I love watching Nigel Danson go through the Lake District.
Oh, yeah.
Those are amazing, and somehow he's finding places that, and I think he's sometimes kind of careful about like not exactly saying where he is,
No.
just so that it doesn't get overrun
Yeah.
with people. So I respect that.
Yeah, and the Lake District is beautiful, but it's quite if you there are a lot of people that don't want to be there at sunrise. So Nigel's
Right,
often out at
right.
sunrise.
Exactly,
But yeah,
exactly.
it's one of those places that it will have its spots, but yeah, if you're prepared to hike up a good hill, then
Hmm.
you can find some quiet.
That's probably one of those times when a little bit of research is useful. So not to find where people are going and where should I go, but where are people
Yeah,
going that I can go the opposite direction, maybe.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
Knowing you're going to find something. Well, you mentioned in some of our pre-conversation exchange that you've been exploring the restorative power of creativity through your works and offerings, and you've already
Yeah.
mentioned a little bit about like nature and that being a form of therapy. But I'm wondering what you're learning that might be useful to anyone watching.
Yeah, so what I've mentioned about this sort of therapy, that is, oh, sorry, my cat is just about to walk right
Oh,
in front of the camera.
oh, let's see the
Nala,
cat. Oh, I saw a tail.
here she is.
Is that a Bengal? Or
Yeah, she's a
such a
Bengal. She's a
beautiful, oh,
Bengal.
she's gorgeous.
She's very good. Yeah, she's a really good cat. So, but she's been kind of moving about. But I didn't expect her to walk.
Cats
She
and
doesn't normally walk
cameras.
across the desk. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, there's a comedy moment if you don't want to edit it out.
Oh yeah, I'd
um,
love to keep that.
but that whole therapy is restorative, right? So going
Hmm.
out and enjoying the landscape, getting absorbed, getting lost in the landscape. But I think the other thing really is patience. We can, and I've done this, in my earlier days, where you get excited about going out with your camera, certain conditions or something, um, and then you're sort of rushing to get as many images as possible to capture something before the light changes. I've done it at the beach. I get frustrated when I spend an hour with my camera looking at one patch of sand and water because the light's constantly changing. And so I'd be there for an hour and then I'd kind of look up and the sunset and I'm like, oh, I've missed all the other things I wanted to do here. And then it can feel less restorative if you
Hmm.
leave and then you feel like you haven't accomplished what you set out to achieve. So I think having no expectations, but being patient, be patient with what you expect to come away with, how you look at the landscape, and you can always go back. There's always going to be another sunset, another foggy day, another
Yeah.
autumn. When you are patient with what you're doing and your process, I feel I personally, the patience is more rewarding. It's more rewarding because it's more restorative, but it's more rewarding because it's also, I tend to find like I end up capturing images that I'm more pleased with.
It seems like if you take that attitude, there's no way you could come away from your experience disappointed.
Yeah,
Because we're
exactly.
only disappointed when we have expectations that aren't met.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
releasing those expectations are
yeah.
what gives us a lot of freedom.
And I did, I remember once going out and being really excited by these conditions. And there's a composition there. Quick, take the photo, blah, blah, on to the next one. And I got home and I got them all on the back of the camera, and so many of them I looked at and thought, that's not quite right. That
Mm.
needed to be that, and I ended up not having as many trophies as I thought I'd got. Whereas if I'd slowed down, been patient, taken my time more, I would have had more photographs that I would have been more satisfied with.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that reminder, because patience is not always it's not always the virtue that we choose to practice
No,
when we get
no.
excited.
Yeah.
You know,
And I appreciate as well. I mean, like I say, we don't get snow that often, so when
right?
you get it, you like seize the day. And some people don't have a lot of time to go out and photograph. They get maybe one day a week, or not even one day a week,
Hmm.
one day a month, because they've got family or jobs or whatever. So in that one day, they want to make the most of it.
Yeah. And even then, I would say you're going to make more of it if you are patient with yourself and with whatever shows up.
Yeah.
Even as you feel the urgency, maybe, of it.
Yeah.
Well, we've touched on this a little bit, and I wondered if you wanted to add anything to this idea of passion projects. Like, I'm wondering if you considered the Imagine series and the Silence as passion projects, or is there something else that you mean by that?
I guess passion project is if there's something that you are particularly passionate about that ignites that creativity in you, then it's a good way to focus your work, because it can be easy to sort of wonder. I mean, creatively wonder, so whilst I'll photograph what catches my eye, I know that I'm still going out and working with things that excite me and that give me that sort of passionate feeling, like I was describing about going out into the woodland in autumn, and it's like a jewelry box to me. And it's interesting because, like, I guess you see it with photographers that photograph a particular subject. So Simon Baxter is an amazing woodland photographer here in the UK, and then I'm sure you've heard of Rachel Talabart, who is a big seascape photographer, and obviously they are passions for them. The landscape, the seascape, just being out in nature in all its forms, I am passionate about. But having that passion, again, it comes back to giving you that anchor, that thing that pulls you in and grounds your work. And I think if you then turn that passion into a creative project, a photography project, that's when it starts to hang together and sit together and look like a project. And it could be that you're photographing a local area that's experienced tourism damage or wildfire damage, or it could just be an area that's just incredibly beautiful through your eyes. Whatever it is, whether it's a thing or just a place, take that passion that you feel for something and make that a creative or photographic project.
Yeah. So really paying attention to what you are drawn to, what pulls you, what intrigues you. I think of like what makes me feel curious to learn more.
Yeah, and I think as well it comes into one of the things that again that we've touched on before the this podcast was when you get a creative lull, you can sometimes. People get quite frustrated and need to find a way to get out of that funk that they're in. And the way that you can do that would be to consider, okay, what am I passionate about? And how can I just focus on that? Take the funnel and narrow it down into something to go out and start working with. And that would be a way that I would think of trying to get out of that sort of creative funk if I'm feeling frustrated by it.
Well, something that just popped into my head was especially maybe it's around the creative funk and noticing what you're drawn to is it seems like it would be really important, super important, not to self-censor what it is that you're drawn to. So for example, I'm thinking about, I just drove past it this morning. There's this really large former, I think it was a piano factory that has been derelict for, I don't know how long, before my husband and I moved to this town. And there's finally activity happening of tearing, renovating and tearing parts of it down and whatnot. But because it's been derelict, derelict buildings are kind of interesting, right? Especially older ones, if there's broken glass and, all sorts of things. And I was passing by and I thought, I really want to come back here with my camera. And there was just something interesting about the textures, the lines, the history, and And even then I could find myself sort of self-censoring, thinking like, would that be interesting to anybody but me? Like, who cares? Or somebody would be like, why are you taking a picture of an old building? I know fellow photographers would probably not think that way, but you see what I mean? Like I noticed my
Yes.
attraction, and then I
Yeah.
immediately was like thinking about how it might look through somebody else's eyes.
Do
And
you know, I totally get what you're saying, because when I first started doing my multiple exposure work, I sat with some of my images on my laptop for a while, quite nervous about sharing them on social media, which I know sounds a bit ridiculous, really, when you think of it in a very sensible way, shall we say. But and it wasn't like I didn't have a massive following or anything like that. It wasn't like I had some massive reputation that I was about to ruin. But I was just nervous because I loved them, and I didn't want somebody else to tell me or to feel like, I don't know. It was just a hard. I don't know what it was. It was just a hard thing to do initially, and then I just kind of thought, I don't care. This is who I am as a creative person, and this is the work I make. And it's interesting when you say whether my work is abstract or literal, it still looks like my work. I've had quite a few people say that to me on Instagram. They'll say, "Oh, as soon as a photograph of yours comes up, I always know it's yours." But that has never been intentional. As in, I haven't always I don't look at my feed and go, "Oh, that doesn't fit, I must take that off." I just make what is right at the time, and it goes on my website if it's one for the collection, or it goes on social media. I think because I don't now censor it for other people, it is authentic to me. And I think when people's work is authentic, you see it.
Yes. It's the censoring that makes us not necessarily inauthentic, but it makes us look like everybody else, because we're censoring because we're worried or thinking about how somebody else is going to perceive it.
Yeah.
So we do what we feel like is acceptable.
Yes.
And that waters us down.
Well, it does, and it's understandable, because we're humans, and we get hurt, and we don't want to be hurt. And when you've made something that you've put your passion into, and you love it, you don't want somebody else, or a whole bunch of other people. You want everybody else to love it too. It's just normal. It's human nature. And I think to say that you don't care what other people thinks is wrong. But I had to tell myself it was okay for other people to not like what I was doing. It didn't mean that it had any less value. And because art is so subjective, there would be somebody out there that liked what I was doing, even if it was the minority and not the majority. And that's okay. I mean, you look at some of the art that goes into the major galleries all over the world, contemporary art and things. There are a lot of people that would look at it and it wouldn't be their cup of tea. It wouldn't be their taste. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have value, and doesn't mean that the artist shouldn't make it.
Absolutely. And I would go so far as to say, like, if somebody has a negative reaction to it, that's more than okay. Because that means that I, as an artist, have put a stake in the ground of some kind. Like, I have really shown up in the way I want to. And if that evokes a reaction in somebody, that's better than indifference.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I love what you said about, if I put it up there, I'm just accepting somebody's not going to like this. This is not going to be everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
And I think that's how we get that little bit thicker skin, to be able to do that. Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, I'm curious if there are any resources or people you follow that you find yourself sharing a lot that you would like to share with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, so there's a book I'd really recommend, which I don't know if anybody else would have mentioned it, because I think it does get talked about in creative circles and in photography. It's called The Meaning in the Making. It's written by Sean Tucker. And I just can't really stress enough how everybody should just go and read it. It touches on so many different facets of creativity. I've read it. I'm actually, over my Christmas break, I'm planning to read it again, because it really grounds you. You know, that whole thing we were just talking about having the confidence to be authentic and be yourself. You know, there's a great section where he talks about social media, and it's just, you're reading it going, God, this is just so true. You know, the way we think about social media and the number of followers we have and the number of likes we have are just, they're not important. And they're not necessarily even representative of how good your work is. And I don't like the word good, because how do you define art as good or bad? But it's so that would be a recommendation. In terms of people, so I've mentioned Rachel Talabart. She was an initial inspiration for me, only because when I first saw some of her sirens photographs, I thought, my goodness, these have been made by somebody off of the back of a boat in the Southern Ocean. And then researched her and discovered they were made an hour and 15-minute drive down the road from me off the coast of New Haven. Which, when there's a cracking storm going on, you know, whether you're photographing or not, it draws a crowd, because the just phenomenal dance of the ocean, well, the English Channel in our case, going on with the movement of these waves. They bounce off a wall. I discovered her work in COVID, and I guess I was feeling like, oh, I've got to, you know, I'm picking up my camera again, but I can't travel. I can't go to the epic landscapes and the mountains and the views and the coast and all of these things. But actually, I thought, hang on a minute, this is local to me. So I can go out locally. I can start locally. So that was a big thing. Then I came across Valda Bailey's work. I don't know if you know Valda. Okay, so she's a multiple exposure photographer, and that was, I think I'd kind of come across the term before, but I hadn't really sort of come across any work that had really caught my eye. And I just saw her work and found it really inspiring. And I'd really recommend looking her up. She does do some of her work in Photoshop. And I don't have a problem with people that choose to do it in Photoshop or in camera. I know she does some in camera as well, but her work is some of it's very abstract. Some of it's landscape, some of it's not. I've heard her talk in a podcast, and she'll say, you know, she'll photograph a wall, a leaf on the tree, and the edge of a teacup, you know, and then the way she kind of blends it all together, and, you know, it's shape and formation and color and tone, texture. And then she's even enhanced some of her work with like gold leaf and things and varnishing once it's been printed. So her work is really beautiful, and I love her work, and she was a big inspiration. Vivian Maier speaks for itself, really, but particularly her New York work from the 1950s. I just think, well, she was a trailblazer, right, in female photography. The confidence to go out in New York in the early 1950s with a camera, taking candid street photos. You know, I struggle to do street photography now, you know, because of the reaction and things. But so Vivian's work I find really inspiring. Outside of the photography sphere, Ellis O'Connor is a painter. I believe it's oils, maybe acrylics. She's based up in Scotland, and her work just really speaks to me. It's really elemental. It's absolutely beautiful. In fact, I will ping you her account on over, you know, when we finished. I'll ping you her Instagram account and her website. She's just a lovely human. Seems to be a really lovely human being. I've seen her speak, but her work is just amazing. We're in the process of buying a new house, and there's a lot of renovation coming up in the next couple of years. But at some point, I'm going to buy one of her pieces and have it on the wall, because it's just, I don't know, it's just stunning. So
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I can't wait to see. I can't wait.
Yeah.
And so thank you for sharing those. And definitely I will add links in the description so that if folks are interested, they can follow and learn more. And I think for Vivian Meyer, I will add, the reason I learned about her was through Alex Kilby and the Photographic Eye channel. He does a
Yeah.
really good job of fairly consistently showcasing the great photographers. And I
Yeah.
know he has
Okay.
at least one episode dedicated to her. So
Yeah.
we'll definitely be sharing that. Yeah. So where do you hang out the most, or where would you like for folks to be connected with you?
So I'm mostly on Instagram. I have dabbled with Threads a little bit. I used to have a Twitter account, and then when it became X, I couldn't get into the account, and then just gave up trying to get into the account. And actually, I hear it's not a very nice platform anymore. So I don't really, I don't want to be investing any more time in social media. So I'm not going to be going down the Snapchat route or anything like that. But Instagram, I like. There's a community on there that I engage with quite a bit, and some really lovely folk on there. So that's a good place to kind of keep up to date with what's kind of going on a week-to-week basis. I don't post anything particularly detailed like some people, but little snippets. But I've also got my website, and through that, if people wish to know more, then I have a newsletter that people can sign up to, subscribe to. I don't necessarily publish it every month. I publish it when I feel I've got something that is worth sharing or I want to share. And it's a fairly new thing for me. It's called Insights, my newsletter. From next autumn, I will be full-time in photography and branching out into another career in a smaller way. But photography is going to be my main thing. And I've got lots of workshops already in the planning. A lot of them are collaborations with other photographers, because I'm a big fan of collaborations for lots of reasons. So the newsletter is the first place to find out about what's going on in that space, and to also be able to sign up for workshops, of which the first ones will be released in early 2025.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Wendy. Congrats on making that shift to the full-time photography in the coming year. And that's very exciting. And thanks for your generous sharing. So much wisdom, so many reminders of things, new ways of thinking about how we're approaching the landscape. So just very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. It's been really nice to chat to you, and I really, it's a real honor to be asked on your podcast.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Let us know in the comments what was most useful or meaningful to you, and be sure to subscribe so that you're notified of future episodes. This channel is made possible in part by Nature Photography classes and their Inspired Creator Grant. You can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspiredcreator. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.